They crossed the line. And now, the whole galaxy is about to learn what happens when you push humanity too far. It started as a simple frontier skirmish, something that should have been nothing more than a footnote in the endless, grinding conflicts between empires. But this time, the enemy made a mistake. They didn't just attack a human outpost. They didn't just destroy a fleet. No. They did something far worse. They thought they could break humanity. And that was their greatest miscalculation. Imagine this, a distant colony world, New Avalon, orbiting the pale blue star of Gliese 1152, a beacon of human determination, thriving on the very edge of the known galaxy. Towering spires of metal and glass stretched toward the heavens, home to over 23 million colonists. The planet had taken decades to terraform, decades to build into a bastion of progress. A world that symbolized everything humanity stood for: resilience, ambition, the refusal to yield. Then, without warning, the sky darkened. It started with a flicker in the planet's orbital defense grid. Minor power fluctuations, nothing unusual in the vast void of space. But then, the satellites went silent. The planetary AI, designed to monitor and predict threats, registered something impossible. Hundreds of uncharted warships emerging from slipspace just outside the system's gravity well. Not a patrol, not a diplomatic fleet. This was an invasion, force, and they weren't coming to negotiate. Massive warships descended, their hulls a sickly green, their weapons glowing with a violent, eerie light. The Zalvani Imperium had arrived. To the rest of the galaxy, they were a dominant force, ancient and unchallenged. Their empire stretched across over 1,000 star systems, ruling with an iron fist. Their doctrine was simple: assimilate or eradicate. For thousands of years, they had crushed species that dared resist, leaving nothing but ash in their wake. Humanity, however, was not like the others. The attack began with orbital bombardments. White-hot lances of plasma rained down from the sky, turning cities into molten craters within seconds. Shock troopers, towering insectoid warriors, descended in swarms, their chitinous armor gleaming under the burning atmosphere. They didn't just want to conquer, they wanted to exterminate. They wanted to make an example of humanity. But humanity doesn't break. Even as the cities burned, even as entire continents were reduced to rubble, the defenders of New Avalon fought back with everything they had. Outnumbered, outgunned, and with no reinforcements in sight, they waged a desperate resistance. Civilian ships were turned into makeshift bombers. Orbital platforms, meant for deep space mining, were overloaded and detonated like massive warheads. Even children, barely old enough to understand war, carried messages between the underground bunkers, refusing to surrender. But against the sheer might of the Zalvani Imperium, it wasn't enough. Within 72 hours, New Avalon had fallen. The final transmission came from the planet's governor, a former Marine who had survived 3 wars and built an entire world from nothing. Bloodied, battered, but unbroken, he stood before the last operational communications tower, staring directly into the camera. His voice, hoarse but defiant, echoed through the void. "This is Governor Elias Reigns of New Avalon. Humanity does not kneel. You think you've won? You think this is the end? No. This is just the beginning. You crossed the line today. You started a war you cannot comprehend. And I swear on every soul you've taken, we will end you." Then, the transmission cut. The screen went dark. The planet was silent, but the galaxy was not. The message had already been received. Not just by Earth, not just by the United Terran Alliance, but by every human colony, every warship, every outpost scattered across the stars. In a matter of hours, humanity had gone from cautious expansionists to an enraged war machine. The response was immediate. Fleets were mobilized. Warships once reserved for defensive operations were unleashed. Humanity's most brilliant strategists, tacticians and commanders gathered in one place, their eyes set on a singular goal: vengeance. And at the heart of it all, one question burned brighter than the dying embers of New Avalon. What happens when humanity is pushed too far? Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Right now, HFY Chronicles-849 is just beginning. and your support means everything. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. And now, let's dive deeper. Who were the Zalvani Imperium? Why did they think they could challenge humanity? And what would happen next, now that the full force of Earth's wrath had been unleashed? The fall of New Avalon was supposed to be a warning. The Zalvani Imperium believed they had sent a message, one that would spread terror across the stars, forcing humanity to bow before their rule. But they had misunderstood something fundamental. Humanity doesn't bow. It doesn't cower. It doesn't surrender. It adapts. It endures. And when pushed too far, it retaliates. The moment Governor Elias Raines's final transmission was received, the United Terran Alliance went into a state of total war. Humanity had faced conflicts before. Wars for resources, ideological battles, border skirmishes with minor alien factions, but nothing like this. The Zalvani Imperium was the largest, most powerful empire the galaxy had ever known. And they had just declared themselves humanity's mortal enemy. The first response wasn't immediate retaliation. It was silence. The kind of eerie, calculated silence that comes before a devastating storm. The Zalvani, accustomed to lesser species crumbling before their might, expected humanity to send diplomats begging for peace. They expected panic. Instead, Earth's response came in the form of 3 simple words, transmitted across all known channels: acknowledge, retaliation, imminent. Across the Sol system, the largest military mobilization in human history began. The war machine that had been dormant, focused on defense and exploration, now awakened into something the galaxy had never seen before. Factories on Mars, once dedicated to civilian starships, were converted overnight to produce warships at an unprecedented rate. The Dyson Yards of Jupiter, originally constructed to harvest solar energy, became the heart of humanity's new war fleet. Sleeper programs, classified black projects buried deep within Earth's military infrastructure, were activated, releasing weapons and technologies that had been deemed too dangerous for peacetime. And then, there was Project Revenant, a program whispered about in the darkest corners of intelligence agencies. A failsafe, meant only to be used in the event of an existential threat. It was never meant to see the light of day. But the Zalvani had made sure that every ethical boundary, every restraint humanity had placed on itself, had been shattered. Among the elite ranks of the UTA's Special Warfare Division, a message was received. A single word: execute. And so, the war truly began. While fleets were assembled and warships were forged in the heart of dying stars, humanity's first strike wouldn't come from space. It would come from within. The Zalvani Imperium was ancient, powerful, but also arrogant. Their empire was vast, spanning across over 1,000 systems, with countless conquered species forced into servitude. These species had lived under the Zalvani's rule for centuries, believing that resistance was futile. But now they saw something different. They saw humans, the so-called newcomers to the galactic stage, standing defiant against an enemy that had once seemed invincible. And so, the fires of rebellion were lit. Human intelligence operatives, embedded deep within Zalvani-controlled territories, began their work. Supply depots exploded in the dead of night. Communication networks collapsed without warning. Strategic weapons mysteriously vanished from heavily guarded vaults. Entire battalions of Zalvani troops found their warships sabotaged, their reactors rigged to overload the moment they entered hyperspace. It wasn't just war. It was psychological annihilation. The Zalvani, for the first time in their long, ruthless history, were afraid. They responded with brutality. Planets suspected of harboring rebels were scorched, their populations executed en masse. But that only fueled the flames. The more they tightened their grip, the more resistance grew. Uprisings erupted across their empire, fueled by humanity's promise of vengeance. Species that had suffered for generations now saw an opportunity, a chance to break free, to rise against their oppressors. And then, when the Zalvani were at their most vulnerable, humanity struck. Not with diplomacy, not with warnings, but with overwhelming force. At the heart of the Zalvani Imperium lay the Dralthis system, a strategic hub from which their fleets were deployed. Its defenses were legendary, designed to withstand full-scale assaults from any known power in the galaxy. Massive fortress stations orbited the system's twin suns, each armed with enough firepower to destroy entire fleets before they could even reach the inner planets. A direct attack was suicide. But humanity had never been interested in fighting fair. Instead of engaging the fleet head-on, the first wave of the assault came in the form of a weapon never before seen in galactic warfare. A weapon that broke every known law of physics, a weapon that was considered impossible. The Shroud Bomb. Developed in absolute secrecy, it wasn't a traditional bomb. It didn't explode. It didn't release energy in the conventional sense. Instead, it tore a hole in the very fabric of space, creating a localized event horizon, a miniature black hole, collapsing everything within its range into nothingness. The Zalvani never saw it coming. One moment, their fortress stations stood vigilant. The next, they were gone, erased from existence. With the system's defenses crippled, the second wave arrived. The Seventh Fleet, humanity's elite war armada, led by Admiral Selene Carter, the most feared strategist in Terran military history. Her orders were simple: show them what fear truly is. And so, humanity delivered its first message of vengeance. The attack on Dralthis was swift, brutal, and methodical. Zalvani warships, accustomed to overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers, suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outclassed. The Seventh Fleet didn't fight like a conventional navy. It moved like a phantom, striking from impossible angles, exploiting weaknesses the Zalvani didn't even know they had. But the true horror came when the boarding teams landed. Human. Marines clad in advanced exosuits tore through Zalvani defenses like a wildfire. They didn't fight like lesser species. They didn't flee. They didn't hesitate. They fought with precision, ruthlessness, and purpose. Because this wasn't just a battle. It was retribution. When the dust settled, the Dralthis system was no longer under Zalvani control. It belonged to humanity now. And the message was clear. You took one of ours. We will take everything from you. For the first time in history, the Zalvani Imperium was on the defensive. For the first time, an enemy had struck fear into their hearts. And this was just the beginning. The war had only just begun. What would happen next? How far would humanity go to avenge the fallen? And what dark secrets lay within Project Revenant? Secrets so terrible that even humanity had once feared them. War was no longer just a concept. It was now reality. The Dralthis system, once a beacon of Zalvani dominance, lay in ruins. Its mighty fortresses, once thought indestructible, had been ripped from existence. Its fleets, once considered invincible, had been shattered like glass. Humanity had struck, and in doing so, it had sent a message across the entire galaxy. But the war was far from over. In the aftermath of Dralthis, the Zalvani Imperium finally understood what they had done. They had awakened a predator unlike anything they had ever faced. Their conquests, their centuries of dominance, their belief in their own superiority, none of it mattered now. Because the humans weren't fighting for power. They weren't fighting for territory. They were fighting for vengeance, and vengeance is a force that cannot be reasoned with. But even as the first human victories shook the galaxy, the United Terran Alliance knew that winning a battle was not the same as winning the war. The Zalvani Imperium was still the largest power in the known universe. Their forces outnumbered humanity's by 100 to 1. Their empire stretched across thousands of systems, with entire worlds dedicated solely to building war machines. If humanity was to survive, it needed more than just firepower. It needed a strategy. And so, the next phase of the war began. Not with a fleet, but with a shadow. The first offensive operation wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a direct assault. It was something far more terrifying. The Midnight Protocol. For centuries, humanity had perfected asymmetrical warfare, the art of fighting a vastly superior enemy by exploiting their weaknesses. Earth's history was filled with examples: guerrilla tactics, cyber warfare, sabotage, psychological manipulation. It was never about who had more weapons. It was about who could use them smarter. And now, that philosophy was being applied on A galactic scale. Sleeper agents, long thought to be mere myths, activated across the Zalvani Imperium. These weren't ordinary spies. They were ghosts, operatives who had been embedded within Zalvani society for decades, waiting for the day they would be called upon. They were former slaves, traitors, diplomats, figures who had lived among the enemy, studied their weaknesses, learned their secrets, and now they unleashed hell. Massive energy grid failures crippled Zalvani shipyards, halting the production of warships. Bioengineered viruses swept through their ranks, targeting only their species with lethal precision. Key commanders vanished overnight, their bodies never found, their security details slaughtered in ways that suggested something inhuman had done it. Panic spread through the Imperium like wildfire. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Zalvani found themselves fearing the dark, and then came the second phase of the war, the offensive. Humanity didn't just attack the Zalvani, they broke them. The UTA fleet didn't engage in long, drawn-out wars of attrition. They struck where it hurt the most. Vital supply lines, industrial hubs, key hyperspace junctions. They denied the Zalvani the ability to wage war. The most daring strike came in the Orionis Expanse, home to the Imperium's largest weapons manufacturing facilities. It was a system so heavily defended that no fleet had ever dared to approach it. Until now. Under the command of Admiral Celine Carter, a single Terran battle group executed a maneuver that rewrote the rules of war. They folded space itself, using experimental technology that should have been impossible, skipping past the Zalvani defenses and appearing directly inside the enemy's core facilities. It was a suicide mission. Except, it wasn't, because humanity had something the Zalvani didn't. Sacrifice. The 7th Fleet's Black Squadron, a unit of elite, cybernetically enhanced pilots, deliberately overloaded their reactor cores, turning their ships into planetary-scale bombs. The explosion wasn't just physical, it was existential. It ripped the very fabric of subspace, creating a cascading effect that collapsed the entire Orionis Expanse into a dimensional rift. 1/3 of the Zalvani Imperium's entire war industry was gone. And now, they were truly afraid. The Zalvani had always ruled through fear. They had always assumed their size, their power, their brutality would keep them untouchable. But now, the fear belonged to them. For the first time, the Zalvani High Council convened in desperation. The war was spiraling out of control. Their empire was no longer expanding. It was shrinking. And at the center of it all was a single phrase, repeated across every battlefield, every communication intercepted by their intelligence agencies. Phrase that would soon become legend. They crossed the line. Now the whole galaxy faces humanity's wrath. The question was no longer whether humanity could be stopped. It was how much destruction they were willing to unleash before the galaxy finally learned never to challenge them again. But even as humanity's war machine tore through the stars, something far darker was brewing beneath the surface. Project Revenant. A name spoken in hushed tones. A name erased from every official document. A name that even the highest-ranking Terran officials feared. Because when you push humanity far enough, you don't just face war. You face annihilation. And Project Revenant? It was the endgame. The galaxy had never seen anything like this. The Zalvani Imperium, once the pinnacle of power, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Their fleets, once counted in the millions, had been reduced to desperate strike forces, barely able to hold their own against the relentless onslaught of humanity's wrath. Their supply lines had been cut, their industrial worlds crippled, their colonies burning under the shadow of Terran retribution. And yet, humanity did not stop. Because the war had ceased being about strategy. It had ceased being about victory. Now, it was about justice. Now, it was about payback. And at the heart of it all stood Project Revenant. The name had surfaced in intercepted transmissions, whispered by terrified Zalvani commanders, referenced in encrypted messages that even the Imperium's most skilled codebreakers couldn't decipher. What was Project Revenant? To the Zalvani, it was an enigma wrapped in fear. To humanity, it was the final act of war. But to understand Project Revenant, one had to understand what the Imperium had truly done. The massacre of Epsilon Eridani was only the beginning. For centuries, the The Zelvani had subjugated entire civilizations, leaving entire species extinct in their endless pursuit of expansion. Entire homeworlds had been reduced to dust, their populations either slaughtered or taken as genetic stock for their bioexperiments. Humanity had discovered the archives of horror buried deep in captured Zalvani data cores. Thousands of species erased, entire cultures forgotten. Among the data was the fate of Solana Prime, an advanced civilization that had once flourished near the galactic core. They had resisted the Imperium, and for that, they had been wiped from existence. The Zalvani hadn't simply conquered them. They had exterminated them, and worse, they had done so systematically, using bioweapons designed to eliminate every last genetic trace of the Solani people. Humanity had seen the images. They had heard the screams, and that was when the United Terran Alliance made its decision. They would do what no other species had dared to do. They would ensure that the Zalvani never had the chance to do this again. Thus, Project Revenant was born. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a fleet. It was a doctrine. A new way of waging war. One that didn't just aim to defeat the Zalvani. It aimed to erase them. Forever. The protocol of no return it began in the shadow of Gorvax 6, a fortress world deep in Zalvani space. The UTA's most advanced stealth warships slipped through enemy defenses, their presence undetected until it was too late. They didn't bomb the planet. They poisoned it. A biological weapon, unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, was deployed. Into the planet's atmosphere. Engineered with genetic targeting, it did one thing and one thing only. It hunted Zalvani DNA. Within 3 days, the planet was silent. Not a single Zalvani remained. But the forests still grew. The oceans still thrived. The air was still clean. Because humanity hadn't unleashed destruction. They had unleashed replacement. The bioweapon did not simply kill the Zalvani. It rewrote the ecosystem, altering the very foundation of the biosphere to accommodate new, non-Zalvani life. Gorvax 6 would never again be a world of conquest. It would become a world reborn. The rest of the galaxy watched in horror, because this was something new. War had always been about destruction, about dominance, but humanity had found a way to erase an enemy without leaving scars. To the Zalvani, it was the ultimate nightmare. To the rest of the galaxy, it was a warning. And then, the attacks escalated. The cybernetic Armageddon Zalvani systems began to fail overnight. Their hyperlanes shut down without warning. Their warships, once indomitable, turned on their own fleets as their AI systems were hijacked. Humanity had perfected cyber warfare, and now they were using it as a weapon unlike anything before. But it wasn't just military systems that were attacked. It was infrastructure. Food distribution networks collapsed. Communication grids went dark. Entire Zalvani worlds found themselves cut off from one another, their empire fragmenting into isolated, helpless enclaves. Panic set in. And then, the final blow. The Zalvani homeworld, Prime Meridian, was no longer safe. For millennia, it had been the heart of their empire. A planet fortified beyond belief, where their rulers resided in opulent decadence, secure in the knowledge that no enemy could ever set foot on their soil. That illusion was shattered when the first Terran ships broke through their defenses. Not with guns, not with bombs, but with something far worse. Humanity had captured thousands of Zalvani prisoners throughout the war, and now they were being sent home. Only they weren't the same, because they had been changed. Nanite infestations, neural rewrites. Human scientists had discovered a way to alter the Zalvani themselves, infecting their minds with something that could never be undone. They were no longer Zalvani, they were something else. And when they walked the streets of Prime Meridian, their own people ran in terror. The war was over. Humanity had done something unthinkable. They had won, not by conquest, not by brute force, but by making the Zalvani cease to exist. And that was when the Galactic Union finally stepped in. The rest of the galaxy had feared the Zalvani for centuries. But now, they feared humanity more. If the war didn't stop now, there would be nothing left of the Zalvani Imperium. The United Terran Alliance was given one ultimatum: end the war, or face the combined wrath of the rest of the galaxy. And for the first time, humanity had a choice. continue down the path of total extermination, or let the Zalvani live, knowing they would never rise again. And deep within the halls of the Terran High Command, the decision was made, because humanity had already crossed the line. And now, the question wasn't whether they would stop. It was whether the galaxy could ever sleep soundly again. The war had started as a retaliation. It had escalated into a crusade. But now it was something else entirely. The Zalvani Imperium, once the galaxy's unchallenged superpower, had become a scattered collection of terrified remnants. Their fleets had been shattered. Their leaders had been hunted down, executed, or worse, rewritten. Their very identity as a species was at risk of being erased, not by fire or blood, but by something infinitely more terrifying. Human ingenuity. Because humanity had not just beaten the Zalvani, they had broken them. The galaxy watched in horror as the United Terran Alliance unveiled the final stage of its war doctrine. The Zalvani collapse, a psychological nightmare. Conquering a species by military force was one thing. Conquering them through their own minds was another. Human scientists had discovered a chilling truth buried deep in Zalvani neurobiology, a weakness in their genetic code. The Zalvani had evolved as a collectivist species, their neural structures built around the need for hierarchical obedience. Unlike humans, who thrived in chaos, improvisation, and decentralized resistance, the Zalvani needed order. So, what happened when order ceased to exist? They collapsed. The Terran Psychological Warfare Division, an organization that the rest of the galaxy would come to fear more than any warship, unleashed the most devastating attack of all. Not bombs, not invasions, but ideas. Carefully engineered, memetic viruses were released into the Zalvani communications networks. Subliminal messages woven into their broadcasts, patterns embedded in their neural data streams, whispers seeded through their artificial intelligence infrastructure. What did these messages say? Nothing obvious, nothing crude, just doubt. The kind of doubt that festered, the kind of doubt that ate away at the mind. Your leaders are lying to you. Your gods have abandoned you. There is no empire. There is no future. There is only the void. Within weeks, entire Zalvani planets began to collapse without a single human soldier setting foot on their surface. Governments crumbled overnight. Military leaders refused to issue orders. Fleets abandoned their posts, convinced they were fighting for an empire that no longer existed. And then, the unthinkable happened. Zalvani surrender. Or something worse. The first Zalvani worlds defected. Not because of military pressure, not because of strategic gain, but because they believed they already belonged to humanity. The psychological warfare had worked too well. Zalvani governors, those who had once sworn to destroy Earth, began begging for Terran citizenship. Entire populations welcomed human fleets as liberators, not conquerors. And this was where the war reached its most dangerous turning point. Because the United Terran Alliance now had to ask itself a terrifying question. If your enemy begs to become part of you, do you let them? For some in the UTA High Command, the answer was obvious. No. The Zalvani had crossed the line first, now they would pay. But others argued something else, that the Zalvani had been victims of their own empire, that the war had proven a greater truth. It was not the Zalvani species that was evil, it was the Imperium itself. And so, for the first time since the war began, a new idea emerged, a new possibility, a new future. The choice that would define humanity. Would humanity finish what it started? Would it wipe the Zalvani from existence, as had been planned? Or would it take another path? Some argued for complete extermination. They didn't spare us. Why should we spare them? Others pushed for integration. If we can break them, we can rebuild them. The debate raged in the halls of the Terran Senate. It divided the military, the politicians, and even the civilians back on Earth. The question was no longer whether humanity had the power to destroy the Zalvani. It was whether humanity had the will to show mercy. But before a decision could be made, the Zalvani did something no one expected. They made a choice of their own. For the first time in history, an enemy tried to surrender to humanity, not as prisoners, but as equals. They didn't want a ceasefire. They didn't want reparations. They wanted to join the United Terran Alliance, to become part of the very species they had once tried to exterminate. And suddenly, humanity stood at the edge of a decision that would define its place in the galaxy forever. Would it become the merciless conqueror the universe feared, or would it become something greater? Because if the Zalvani were willing to give up everything, if they were willing to abandon their empire, their past, even their own identity, then the war had already ended. But was humanity ready to accept what came next? The war had started with fire and vengeance. It had escalated into a crusade, driven by humanity's unyielding wrath. But now, it had become something far more complex. A battle not of weapons, but of ideology, of identity. The United Terran Alliance was no longer merely at war with the Zalvani Imperium. It was at war with itself. Because in the ruins of their fallen empire, the Zalvani had done something no species in galactic history had ever attempted. They surrendered, not in defeat, but in transformation. They weren't just asking for mercy. They were asking to become human. A fractured victory. The galactic debate. Begins news of the Zalvani plea spread like wildfire across human-controlled space. The reaction was immediate and divided. For some, the Zalvani were monsters, oppressors, who had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, species slayers who had invaded Earth and massacred billions. These voices screamed for justice, for vengeance, for complete and total extermination. "Do not let them crawl back into the light," one Terran senator declared before the UTA Council. "They crossed the line first. They must pay the price." But others saw something different. The Zalvani had changed. Their once proud fleets lay in ruins. Their leaders had been hunted down and executed, their government obliterated. And now, what remained of their species no longer spoke of conquest. Only survival. The galaxy had never seen anything like it before. A broken empire begging for assimilation, willing to renounce its name, its sovereignty, even its very culture, if it meant avoiding extinction. And that, more than anything, terrified the other galactic civilizations, because the UTA now held absolute power. This wasn't just about the Zalvani anymore. Every species was watching. If humanity chose extermination, it would send a clear message to the stars: defy Terra, and you will be erased. But if humanity accepted the Zalvani into its fold, then the UTA would become something far greater than an empire. It would become a force of evolution itself. The Zalvani schism, a species divided. But there was another problem, one that even humanity hadn't anticipated. Not all Zalvani wanted to submit. The war had shattered their civilization, yes, but within their shattered remains, two factions emerged. The first, the integrationists, believed that survival meant embracing humanity's rule. They had seen the war's outcome, understood that their empire was beyond saving. They saw no future in resistance, only annihilation. Their leaders pleaded with the UTA to be allowed a place under Terran protection, willing to abandon centuries of Zalvani tradition if it meant avoiding extinction. But the second faction, the purists, refused to bow. These Zalvani saw assimilation as a fate worse than death. To them, surrendering to humanity meant more than just losing the war. It meant losing their souls. They believed that their species would rather die as warriors than live as human slaves. And so, in the outer edges of the galaxy, remnants of the once great Zalvani war machine regrouped in secret, their fleets battered, but still burning with fury. They swore an oath, to strike from the shadows, to fight for their species' right, to exist, even if it took 1,000 years. And the UTA knew that as long as even one Zalvani warship remained free, the war was not truly over. The Terran dilemma: justice or mercy? Within the UTA, the debate raged on. Some in the military saw the Zalvani surrender as a trick, a deception meant to buy them time, to infiltrate human society from within. These voices pushed for total eradication. "We did not start this war," Admiral Carter of the Terran First Fleet argued before the Senate. "But by God, we will end it. Wipe them out before they regroup." Others, however, saw an opportunity. What if humanity could take what was useful from the Zalvani? What if their technology, their knowledge, even their unique biology could be integrated into human civilization? What if, instead of war, there was a better way forward? President Alara Vasquez, leader of the UTA, posed the final question. Do we become what they feared us to be? Or do we become something greater? And so, humanity stood on the precipice of its most important decision yet. Would it embrace vengeance, ensuring that no one ever dared to challenge Earth again? Or would it embrace mercy, proving that even in the face of galactic war, humanity could be more than conquerors? As the final vote approached, the galaxy held its breath. Because what came next would change everything. The debate within the United Terran Alliance reached a boiling point, igniting a firestorm of ideological clashes, political maneuvering, and emotional outbursts that echoed across human-controlled space. The weight of the decision did not rest solely on military leaders or politicians. It had become a moral crisis that gripped every citizen of the UTA. Across Terra and its colonies, people flooded communication networks, broadcasting their opinions in a frenzy of discussion. Some saw the Zalvani surrender as nothing more than a last-ditch deception, a way to survive long enough to rise again. Others believed it to be an unprecedented moment in history, proof that humanity's might was so absolute that even its fiercest enemy now sought to become part of it. The UTA had been at war before, but this was different. Never had an enemy pleaded not just for peace, but for assimilation, for the chance to erase their own history and become part of something greater. It was a level of submission that defied every precedent in galactic history. Behind closed doors, the highest-ranking officials of the UTA convened in secret meetings, dissecting every possible outcome. Military strategists presented projections that showed the risks of allowing the Zalvani to integrate. What if they harbored resentment? What if their acceptance of human rule was a facade? They were a species built on war and expansion. Could they truly abandon the very instincts that had defined them for centuries? The intelligence community feared the creation of a Trojan horse, a hidden danger that could fester within the heart of human civilization and strike when least expected. But the other side of the argument was just as compelling. Humanity had always prided itself on adaptation and resilience. The UTA's greatest strength was not just its technology or military power, but its ability to evolve, to absorb, and improve. The Zalvani offered more than just submission. They offered knowledge, resources, and genetic advantages that could enhance humanity's future. If properly guided, they could be reshaped into something more, something useful. Yet even as the debates raged on within human leadership, the Zalvani themselves were undergoing their own transformation. The surrender had divided their people, in ways no one had predicted. On one side, the integrationists fully embraced their new fate. They discarded their old symbols, their traditions, even their names, in preparation for their rebirth under Terran rule. They sought to prove their loyalty in every way possible, turning over the last remnants of their military secrets, providing detailed intelligence on former allies, and even offering their own bodies for scientific study to better align with human physiology. But their willingness to conform only fueled the fury of the purists, who saw them as traitors beyond redemption. The purists had retreated into deep space, gathering whatever forces they could to launch a final resistance. They knew they could never win in a conventional war, but they did not need victory. They only needed vengeance. Their attacks became unpredictable, their tactics ruthless. They struck without warning, targeting human civilian colonies, space stations, and supply lines. Entire planets fell victim to sudden, brutal assaults, leaving devastation in their wake before the purists disappeared once again into the void. They wanted to show humanity that no matter how powerful they were, the Zalvani spirit would never be extinguished. The purists weren't the only ones who resisted the notion of integration. There were powerful factions within the UTA itself that recoiled at the idea of allowing the Zalvani to walk among them as equals. Military leaders who had fought since the first days of the war, who had lost entire families to the Zalvani invasion, refused to accept any outcome short of extermination. Across human colonies, extremist groups began to emerge, taking matters into their own hands. The idea of seeing Zalvani living side by side with humans was unacceptable to them, and they began launching their own retaliatory strikes. Refugee camps meant to house surrendered Zalvani were burned to the ground. Those who had willingly surrendered were hunted, executed in acts of vengeance carried out in the shadows. It was clear now. This war had not just been about territory or survival. It had been personal. The UTA found itself on the edge of civil unrest. The choice before them was no longer a mere military decision. It was a turning point that would define humanity's future in the galaxy. If they chose extermination, they would cement their reputation as the most feared force in the universe, a species that tolerated no opposition and crushed any who dared defy them. The galaxy would never again question humanity's dominance, but they would also never again trust them. They would become the ultimate conquerors, but at what cost? If they chose integration, they would reshape the very fabric of interstellar civilization, proving that they were not just warriors, but visionaries capable of forging something entirely new. But such a choice carried its own risks. The lingering hatred, the whispers of rebellion, the possibility that the Zalvani could never truly shed their old ways. All of these threatened to fracture the unity of humanity itself. The final decision fell upon President Ilara Vasquez. She stood before the UTA Council, before the billions watching across human space, before the countless alien civilizations who held their breath in anticipation. The weight of history bore down on her shoulders. She knew that no matter what choice she made, it would shape the galaxy for generations to come. The moment had arrived. Humanity would decide its fate, and the fate of its greatest enemy. The entire galaxy watched as she prepared to speak. The air in the Grand Assembly Hall of the United Terran Alliance was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on every individual present. President Ilara Vasquez stood at the central podium, her expression unreadable, yet her eyes carried the unmistakable intensity of someone who understood the gravity of her decision. The council chamber, a vast circular arena built to accommodate delegates from across human space, was eerily silent. Billions watched from across the stars. Soldiers stationed in deep space, civilians huddled around transmission screens in bustling megacities, entire colonies awaiting the words that would determine the future of humanity's place in the galaxy. For decades, war had defined the relationship between humanity and the Zalvani. The atrocities committed, the battles fought, the blood spilled. None of it could be erased. But now, for the first time in history, the victors had the opportunity to decide what came after. Would humanity prove itself as a force of absolute destruction, or would it rise as something greater, something unprecedented? The silence stretched on, each second amplifying the tension. Then, finally, President Vasquez took a deep breath, her voice ringing clear and unwavering as she spoke. The choice had been made. Humanity would not wipe out the Zalvani. It would not give in to the thirst for vengeance that had consumed so many. Instead, it would do what no other species in galactic history had ever dared. It would integrate its greatest enemy into its own ranks. The decision sent shockwaves through the chamber. Gasps, murmurs, and even outright shouts of anger erupted from various factions. Military leaders who had dedicated their entire careers to eradicating the Zalvani clenched their fists in silent fury. Political hardliners who had campaigned on promises of total war looked as if the ground had been ripped from beneath them. And yet, amidst the uproar, there were others who nodded, understanding the depth of what had just been set in motion. The transition would not be immediate, nor would it be without immense challenges. There would be resistance from both sides. Many humans would never accept Zalvani living among them, just as many Zalvani would struggle to abandon the culture that had shaped them for centuries. But the foundation had been laid. The first steps had been taken. The UTA would begin the process of restructuring, incorporating Zalvani into Terran society under strict oversight. Their military capabilities would be dismantled, their leadership dismantled, their warriors retrained, not as conquerors, but as enforcers of a new order, one where they fought not for their former empire, but for the survival and prosperity of a united civilization. Yet even as the first formal directives were put into motion, The consequences of this decision rippled across the stars in ways no one could have anticipated. The purists, those Zalvani who had rejected surrender and vowed eternal resistance, saw this integration as the ultimate betrayal. To them, their brethren had not only surrendered their worlds, but their very souls, bowing to their greatest enemy like domesticated creatures. They had long accepted that they would never reclaim their empire, but now their hatred reached new, unfathomable depths. They no longer fought to reclaim their people, they fought to annihilate them. Their war was no longer just against humanity, but against their own kind. The purists launched their most devastating wave of attacks yet, unleashing brutal terror campaigns against both human and integrationist Zalvani settlements. Cities burned under orbital bombardments, assassination squads infiltrated high-security installations, and cyber warfare crippled crucial networks. No longer bound by any code of honor or restraint, the purists waged war with an almost religious fervor, determined to cleanse the galaxy of what they saw as the ultimate corruption. At the same time, within humanity's own borders, the decision to integrate the Zalvani sparked deep fractures. Entire military factions refused to comply with the new directive, branding it a betrayal of the sacrifices made in the war. Rogue elements within the UTA defense forces abandoned their posts, forming paramilitary cells dedicated to opposing the integration effort. Colonists on the frontiers, many of whom had suffered firsthand at the hands of the Zalvani, refused to accept them as neighbors, forming their own armed resistance movements. For every step taken toward peace, new battle lines were drawn. Amidst this growing chaos, a new challenge emerged, one that no one had foreseen. The Zalvani, even those who had willingly chosen integration, were struggling with an identity crisis that threatened to shatter their very existence. For generations, their purpose had been clear: expansion, conquest, dominance. Now, stripped of that purpose, they were lost. Many struggled to find meaning in a life without war. Their warriors, once feared across the stars, now had no battlefield to call their own. Their traditions, once centered around martial glory, were being erased, leaving behind a cultural void that could not easily be filled. Some sought to embrace human customs, adopting their ways, their ideologies, even their languages. Others fell into despair, unable to reconcile what they had become. And some began to dream of something else entirely. It was from these fractured pieces that a new force began to rise. A movement born not of hatred, nor of submission, but of something entirely different. A faction of both humans and Zalvani who saw the integration not as the end of two civilizations, but as the birth of something new. They rejected the old labels of conqueror and conquered. They refused to be bound by the scars of the past. Instead, they envisioned a future where humanity and Zalvani would not merely coexist, but evolve together into something greater. They were not idealists nor pacifists. They understood that true unity could only be forged in the crucible of fire. And so, as war raged between the purists and the UTA, as terrorist cells and resistance groups sought to undermine the fragile peace, they began their own preparations. Their time had not yet come. The galaxy was not yet ready for what they would become. But in the shadows, beyond the reach of both human and Zalvani authorities, they trained. They gathered knowledge. They built something new, something powerful. They were not the past, nor were they the present. They were the future. And when the time came, they would step forward and change the course of galactic history forever.